don't think I did anything wrong. I just got a little playful. It was a party, there was music, laughter, and maybe I leaned too close when I shouldn't have. He saw everything, and now everyone else knows it too. Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible stories. I'm Liora Vale, and I don't think I did anything wrong. I just got a little playful. It was supposed to be fun, light, harmless. The kind of teasing that makes people laugh and remember you. That night at the party, I was just dancing, letting go after weeks of deadlines and endless chores. Ryan, my co-worker, pulled me in for a spin, and the music was too loud to think. I laughed because everyone else was laughing. For a moment, I felt seen again, like the woman I used to be before marriage turned into calendars and meal plans. Then I saw Evan standing by the doorway, frozen, watching. I waved, tried to play it off, but he didn't wave back. He just set down his glass and walked out. I thought he'd cool off, that he'd come home and we'd laugh about it later. Instead, he went quiet. Too quiet. No yelling, no fight, just space, sharp and clean like glass between us. I kept telling everyone he was being dramatic, that he'd get over it. But sometimes, silence isn't surrender. Sometimes it's the sound of someone already building their way out. The night of the company rooftop party, I felt alive for the first time in weeks. Music pulsed, lights flickered across the glass towers, and people moved in rhythm around me. I'd picked a dress that was daring but still professional, something that made me feel like I belonged in the center of attention. Evan had given me that polite, small smile, the one he uses when he doesn't approve but goes along anyway. I told him confidence never hurt anyone. Ryan arrived late, grinning, joking with everyone. He reached out and spun me on the dance floor, and I laughed, letting go of the week's weight. I told myself it was just a dance, harmless, playful. But Evan stood at the edge, motionless, his eyes fixed on me. I waved, but he didn't return it. I told myself he was overreacting, that men always think too much about nothing. Later, I tried to speak to him. "It's just a little fun," I said. He looked at me calmly and said, "Fun is different when it's public." I laughed nervously, brushing it off. He didn't argue. He just nodded, set his drink down, and walked toward the elevator. I told myself he would come home later, laugh it off, and everything would be fine. When I returned home, the house was quiet, too quiet. 2 mugs sat on the counter, his clean, mine half-finished. The faint smell of coffee lingered. I called his name once, twice. Nothing. He was in the study, typing. I asked him if he was upset. He said, "I'm not upset, I'm noting." I laughed at the word, trying to hide the first stirrings of unease. The next morning, he left early. The note on the fridge said, "Breakfast in the oven." I tore it in half, angry at the calm authority in his handwriting. At work, the party video was still circulating. Friends and co-workers teased me, said I had broken the internet. I smiled and screenshot the comments, trying to feel empowered, but the pit in my stomach grew. That night, I lay awake thinking about the dance, the party, the laughter. I had been playful, confident, harmless, but the folders, the spreadsheets, the hum of the printer somewhere in the house, the calendar reminders on his phone, they were all reminders that he was observing, noting, preparing. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself I was untouchable. Yet for the first time, I wondered if I had underestimated him. The first week after he left the bedroom, I convinced myself it was temporary. Couples needed space, right? He was just sorting his feelings, cooling off, realizing he'd overreacted. That's what I told everyone, even myself. At work, when someone asked if everything was okay, I smiled and said we were just taking a communication break. It sounded mature, modern, almost trendy. I said it with enough confidence that even I almost believed it. Still, I couldn't ignore the small changes. His toothbrush disappeared from the bathroom. His side of the sink stayed dry. He stopped leaving his shoes by the door. The silence in the mornings felt like walking through a museum. Everything neat, untouched, lifeless. I found one of his old hoodies in the laundry basket and wore it around the house just to make it feel less empty. My mother called every day. She said I shouldn't chase him. "Let him miss you," she told me. "Men always come back when they realize what they've lost." I liked the sound of that. It made me feel like I was the prize here, not the one waiting. At work, though, it got harder to hold that tone. The video from the party hadn't died down like I thought it would. It was still being shared around the office. Some co-workers laughed with me about it. Others avoided eye contact. I heard 2 interns whispering that the whole thing looked inappropriate for a married woman. I walked past them with my head high, pretending I didn't hear. Ryan was the only one who kept treating it like a joke. He dropped by my desk with a coffee one morning and said, "You broke the internet." I smiled, pretending not to notice the stares around us. I told him people needed to relax. He said, "They're just jealous you've got the confidence." I laughed and said maybe they were. But when his hand brushed mine as he passed the coffee, I felt that uneasy twinge again. The same one from the dance floor. I wasn't sure if it was guilt or thrill. That night, I tried to talk to Evan. He was sitting on the couch, reading something on his laptop. I asked if he was going to stay angry forever. He said, "I'm not angry." I said, "Then what is this?" He looked at me and said, "This is distance." I told him distance doesn't solve anything. He said, "It clarifies everything." His tone was calm again, too calm. I asked if he wanted to fix this or if he'd already given up. He said, "Fix what you keep denying." I told him he was being cryptic, and he said, "Maybe you should start reading between lines instead of headlines." I had no idea what that meant, but it irritated me. I told him, "Not everyone likes living in riddles." He said, "You like stories, you just don't like endings." Then he closed the laptop and went upstairs. The next morning, I found a small folder on the kitchen counter labeled Household. I opened it, thinking it was bills, but it was just blank printer paper. I rolled my eyes and put it back. A few minutes later, I noticed his phone light up with a notification. Meeting personal 11:40 a.m. I asked what it was. He said, "Just an errand." I said, "Since when do you calendar errands?" He said, "Since they matter." That word, matter, stuck with me the whole day. When I got to the office, my manager called me in. She said HR had received a few complaints about inappropriate behavior at the event. I blinked, trying to look confused. She said it wasn't a formal warning yet, just a reminder that professionalism mattered at company functions. She said she wasn't judging, but perception was everything in business. I nodded, smiled politely, and said it was all blown out of proportion. She said, "Maybe, but your husband was there, wasn't he?" I froze for a second, then said yes. She gave me that pitying smile people give when they think they know more than they should. At lunch, I texted Evan. "Just a heads up, work saw the video. Thanks for your support." He didn't reply. When I got home that evening, the house smelled of fresh coffee. He was standing at the counter, pouring a cup into his mug. I said, "Did you get my text?" He said, "Yes." I waited for more, but that was all. I said, "Do you even care that people are talking about us?" He said, "They're not talking about us. They're talking about you." I said, "You make it sound like I did something terrible." He said, "You made sure they'd have something to talk about." I wanted to shout, but his calmness made me feel ridiculous. I said, "So you're just going to keep punishing me by pretending nothing matters?" He said, "Things matter differently to people who care about consequences." I said, "You mean people like you?" He said, "Exactly." Then he picked up his mug and went to the study. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay awake scrolling through comments under the video. Some called it harmless fun. Others called it disrespectful. One person wrote, If my wife did that, she'd be single by morning. I laughed out loud at that, pretending it didn't sting. 2 days later, I came home early and found him talking quietly on the phone. He ended the call as soon as I entered. I asked who it was. He said, "A friend." I asked which one. He said, "The kind that listens." Then he closed his laptop. I told him I didn't appreciate being shut out of my own marriage. He said, "You shut me out first." I told him he was rewriting history. He said, "That's what happens when someone else keeps the receipts." The next morning, there was a spreadsheet open on his screen. I glanced at it while making coffee. The columns were labeled: date, event, source, notes. The first line read, Friday, rooftop, Ryan, video posted. I said, "What is this, a diary?" He said, "Something like that." I laughed. "You're ridiculous," I said. He didn't respond. At work, the gossip got worse. Clara from HR stopped by my desk and asked if I'd talked things over with my husband yet. I said it was private. She said, "I only asked because he called the office this morning." I froze. "He what?" I asked. She said he'd requested documentation for my employment verification. "Something about joint records," she said. I laughed it off, but my palms were sweating. That night, I confronted him. "You called my office?" I asked. He said, "I needed details." I said, "About what?" He said, "Finances." I said, "You don't even handle the finances." He said, "That's changing." I told him he was acting like he didn't trust me. He said, "Trust isn't something you announce online." I stormed off, slammed the bedroom door, and cried, not out of guilt but out of rage. How dare he make me feel like the villain? I replayed the dance in my head, every smile, every laugh, every hand that clapped. It had been light, playful, spontaneous. Everyone said so. Why was he acting like I'd destroyed our life? A few days later, my mother invited me to lunch. I told her everything. She listened with a smug smile and said, "Men hate losing control. He's punishing you because you embarrassed him." I said that's exactly what I thought. She said, "You just have to hold your ground. Don't apologize for being seen." When I got home that evening, Evan wasn't there. The house was spotless, unnervingly clean. Even the air smelled like lemon polish. On the dining table sat his tablet, still lit. A single email draft was open. Property and account separation, preliminary notes. My heart skipped, but I closed it quickly before I could read more. When he came home later, I pretended not to know. I asked if he wanted dinner. He said he'd already eaten. I said, "At least we could sit together." He said, "There's nothing left to discuss." I told him he couldn't just decide that on his own. He said, "I already did." The next morning, I noticed something strange. A faint smell of toner near the printer. It wasn't printing anything, but the tray was still warm. I opened it. Blank pages again. I started to suspect he was doing something behind my back, but I didn't know what. When I left for work, his car was already gone. I saw a new sticky note on the fridge. "Bring forms." I didn't ask what forms. I didn't want to look curious. At the office, Ryan noticed I was distracted. He leaned close and whispered, "You okay?" I said, "He's acting weird." Ryan said, "You sure he's not seeing someone?" I laughed, but the idea sat heavy in my chest the rest of the day. That evening, when I walked in, Evan was at the table again, typing. I said, "We need to talk." He said, "About what?" I said, "About us." He said, "There isn't an us. There's you and there's paperwork." I didn't know what to say. He stood, placed a sealed envelope on the table and said, "Don't open this yet." I asked what it was. He said, "Proof." Then he walked past me and out the door. For the first time, I felt something close to fear, not of losing him, but of losing control. Every calm word, every note, every folder suddenly made sense in a way I didn't want to admit. He wasn't sulking. He was documenting. That night, I deleted the video from my page. I even sent Ryan a message saying we should keep things strictly professional. He replied with a thumbs-up emoji and nothing else. For some reason, that hurt more than it should have. I went to bed in the empty room, still telling myself it wasn't over. But in the silence, I could almost hear the soft hum of the printer again. Steady, mechanical, unfeeling, like it knew something I didn't yet. The next weekend, there was a birthday dinner for one of Evan's old college friends. I told myself it was the perfect opportunity to show everyone that we were fine, that the party night hadn't damaged anything between us. The restaurant was warm and crowded, the air smelling faintly of garlic and roasted chicken. Soft music played in the background. I wore a new dress, satin, deep green, flowing just enough to feel glamorous without overdoing it. Evan stood beside me, silent as always, his expression careful and unreadable. Our table was long, filled with people I knew and a few I didn't. Friends, family, co-workers, an audience of dozens, all eyes subtly measuring, whispering behind polite smiles. I felt a thrill as I slid into the booth, thinking of how visible I was, how alive I could seem. Ryan appeared, just in time for dessert. I waved at him, my arm brushing against his briefly. I told myself it was innocent, playful, harmless. But I caught Evan's eye. His jaw tightened. He didn't say a word. The dinner began casually. Forks clinked against plates. Laughter floated around us. I told a joke about a work mishap. People laughed. I saw Evan glance down at his hands, fingers tapping the table in a slow, deliberate rhythm. I told myself he was being dramatic. I even laughed to reinforce the notion. He would see that I wasn't upset, that I wasn't wrong. Halfway through the meal, Ryan nudged me, whispering, "You should smile at him. Remind him we're all friends." I gave a small, polite nod, but avoided his gaze. I didn't want Evan to feel I was playing with him. He would notice, and then the rest of the night would be a minefield. He always noticed. That's what scared me. When dessert arrived, I reached for the tiramisu spoon, and my hand brushed Ryan's again. I caught Evan's eye and tried to shrug it off with a small smile, but his look was different this time. He didn't blink. He didn't turn away. It was just that calm, measured stare that cut deeper than anger ever could. I excused myself to the restroom for a moment, telling myself I just needed a breath of air. I stepped out into the hall and heard the soft hum of the air conditioning, the faint echo of laughter from the restaurant. I checked my phone. Hundreds of notifications from the party video. I stared at them, feeling a strange mix of excitement and guilt. I told myself people loved me. I told myself it was attention, nothing more. When I returned to the table, Evan was standing near the window, arms crossed, quietly observing. I sat down and tried to start a conversation about the wine, the atmosphere, something mundane. He gave short answers, his tone flat, careful. I pressed, asking if he was upset about the video. He said, "I told you it wasn't about the video." I insisted, "Then what is it?" He shook his head and said nothing, returning to the silent observation of the room. I laughed to myself, trying to ease the tension, pointing out someone else's comment about the dessert. He said, "I don't care what anyone else thinks." I told him he sounded bitter. He said, "I sound like someone who keeps score." I felt a flicker of panic. Score? What did that mean? I turned to Ryan, hoping for some distraction, and he leaned in, whispering that Evan was probably just tired, that he'd get over it. I smiled at Ryan, feeling that rush of power I always felt when I controlled perception. I told myself I had nothing to hide. I didn't. But Evan's silence felt deliberate, calculated, unnerving. After dinner, people lingered for coffee and after-dinner drinks. I chatted with a few co-workers, laughing a little too loudly, making sure everyone saw me relaxed and cheerful. Evan stayed in the corner, quiet, sipping water. I told myself he was being protective, that he needed space. But there was a subtle tension in the room, a vibration I could feel beneath the laughter. At one point, Clara from HR leaned toward me, whispering, "Are you sure you're okay?" I smiled tightly, saying I was fine, that Evan was just quiet. She gave me a knowing look, one of those glances that make you realize everyone notices more than you think. I laughed to cover the edge of panic that rose in my chest. Later, when everyone moved to the lobby for photos, I caught Evan's hand briefly as we lined up. He didn't flinch, but didn't return the gesture. Someone snapped a picture, and I could see the flash reflected in his glasses. I told myself he would smile later, that he'd forgive me silently. He didn't. He stepped back as the camera clicked, leaving me slightly off-center, perfectly visible. When we finally left the restaurant, I tried to make conversation in the car. He drove quietly, hands steady on the wheel. I asked if he'd like to stop for ice cream. He said no. I told him it was just for fun. He said, "I know what fun feels like." His words were soft but carried weight. I wanted to argue, to dismiss it, but I felt the words die in my throat. At home, he went straight to the study. I followed, trying to sit with him, touch his arm. He moved it just slightly, not enough to be rude, just enough to maintain distance. I told him I didn't understand his behavior. He said, "You will, in time." That phrase echoed in my head long after he went upstairs. The next morning, I noticed small changes I had ignored before. His side of the bed was empty. 2 mugs on the counter, his clean, mine half full. The kitchen was quiet. I asked if he wanted breakfast. He said, "I'm not hungry." I told myself he was just being fussy, that he'd come around. But that word again, hungry, empty, absent, felt like a warning. I tried to talk to him at breakfast. "Can we discuss the dinner last night?" I asked. He said, "There's nothing to discuss." I laughed, thinking he was exaggerating. He said, "You think everything is exaggeration." I felt the first sharp twist of fear in my chest. When I went to work, I saw Clara again. She looked at me with that same knowing expression. "Your husband asked about the dinner," she said quietly. I blinked. "Asked what?" She shrugged. "Details. Who was there? What happened?" I laughed it off, but the nervous twitch in her tone made me pause. At lunch, Ryan nudged me again. "He's serious," he said. "You need to take this seriously." I smiled, telling him he was imagining things. I wanted to believe it. I told myself Evan would come home, we'd have a laugh, and everything would return to normal. When I returned, the house smelled faintly of printer toner. I glanced at the printer. Blank pages had been ejected. I rolled my eyes, muttering about his obsession with order. But inside, I felt the first real flicker of unease. He came home later, and I tried again to talk. "Why are you so quiet?" I asked. He said, "Quiet is easier than saying too much." I told him he was making this complicated. He said, "Life is complicated. Fun is temporary." I asked him to explain. He said, "I don't think you'd understand yet." I felt my chest tighten. His calmness was no longer comforting. It was intimidating. I tried to joke, to lighten the mood, but he didn't respond. He only folded the laundry, neatly, silently. I told myself he'd come around, that he was just testing me. But something about the order, the silence, the careful movements told me this wasn't a test. It was preparation. The next day, I came home to a calendar reminder on his phone. Downtown 9:25. I asked what it was for. He said, "Appointments." I asked which ones. He said, "Important ones." I didn't press further. That night, I posted another picture online, smiling, captioned, "Still shining." I wanted him to see it, to feel something. He didn't even glance at it. I told myself he hadn't noticed, but then I saw the faint outline of a folder sticking out of the shelf labeled Archive A, Archive B. My stomach twisted. I tried to ignore it, laughed to myself while making tea, but a creeping anxiety started to take hold. Evan's calm was not passive. It was methodical, intentional. Every folder, every spreadsheet, Every quiet observation was a thread I hadn't yet followed. A few days later, I caught him using his phone under the table, sending messages I couldn't see. I asked him who he was texting. He said, "People who need information." I said, "What kind of information?" He smiled faintly and said, "The kind that matters." I tried to laugh it off, but the smile didn't reach my eyes. That night, I noticed a USB taped under the taxes folder in the study. I asked him what it was. He said nothing, just kept working. I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe it was for work, maybe it was irrelevant. But when I went to sleep, I realized that everywhere I turned, there was evidence he was quietly, methodically building something I couldn't yet see. The calm stare at dinner, the spreadsheets, the folders, the blank printer pages. They weren't signs of indifference. They were signs of planning, of recording, of preparing for a day I hadn't imagined. And for the first time, I felt the tiniest prick of fear. He wasn't angry. He wasn't sulking. He was collecting, noting, organizing, building a quiet record of everything I had done, every laugh, every dance, every brush of my hand against Ryan. And when I realized that, I knew this was no longer about being playful. This was about control, and he held it in a way I couldn't ignore. The distance between us had grown, imperceptibly at first, and now it felt like a chasm. I tried to tell myself it was temporary. I told myself it was all part of his personality, his way of processing. But even as I said it, I knew deep down that his calm, his distance, was more powerful than my noise, more deliberate than my jokes. And I was running out of time to prove that my version of events mattered. The weekend after the birthday dinner, I decided to take Nate to the park. I thought a walk and some fresh air would clear my head, give me a chance to feel normal again. He was cheerful, running ahead, laughing, while I trailed behind, thinking about Evan. The playground was crowded with parents chatting, kids screaming, dogs barking. I told myself I'd just focus on Nate, that Evan's silence didn't have to follow me everywhere. But of course, my phone buzzed. It was Clara from work, asking if I'd seen the latest office gossip. Someone had taken a clip of me at the party, dancing with Ryan, edited it, and posted it online with a caption about marital boundaries. I laughed, a little too loud. People were exaggerating, I told myself. It was just playful dancing. Ryan waved from across the sandbox, unaware of the chaos his smile had caused. When I got home, Evan was in the kitchen, quietly making tea. The countertops were spotless, 2 mugs carefully placed on opposite sides. I said, "I thought we could have a snack together." He said, "I already ate." I rolled my eyes and told him it was ridiculous to act like he hadn't seen the video or read the comments. He said, "I saw it. I also saw you pretending nothing happened." I tried to explain. It was playful, harmless. People loved it. Even my mother says you're too sensitive. He looked at me and said, "It's not sensitivity, it's consequences." I laughed nervously, trying to make it sound like a joke. He didn't. Later, I noticed a new layer to the house. The study door was closed. The faint hum of the printer filled the air. A small folder on the counter, labeled bank, caught my eye. I asked him what it was. He said, "Just organizing things." I smiled, trying to appear calm. "Organizing what?" I pressed. He said nothing, only went to rinse his mug. The next evening, I hosted a small gathering at the house. I told myself this was a chance to show that we were fine, that the party night hadn't ruined our marriage. Friends arrived, laughing and chatting. I joked about the viral video, leaned on Ryan for support, made light of everything. Evan stayed in the background, observing, silent. Every so often, I caught his eyes, steady, calculating. At one point, Nate tugged at my hand, asking about his father. I tried to explain that Daddy was busy, but he looked puzzled. I felt that first real twinge of guilt. I told myself it was temporary, that he'd understand later. But even Nate seemed to sense the tension. the distance that hadn't been there before. After the guests left, I tried to approach Evan. "Can we talk about tonight?" I asked. He shook his head. "Talking won't fix what people saw," he said. I frowned. "It's just friends, just laughter. Why are you making this bigger than it is?" He looked at me, calm, and said, "You made sure it would matter." I felt my chest tighten. The calmness wasn't passive. It was deliberate, controlled. I asked, "What do you mean?" He said, "I've been keeping track. Everything that happened, everything you've done to make yourself the center of attention." I laughed nervously, trying to mask the fear creeping up. He didn't laugh. That night, I lay awake, thinking about all the moments I had brushed off. The party, the video, the birthday dinner, even the way I let Ryan touch my arm at the table. I tried to tell myself that Evan was overreacting, that he would come around. But the evidence of his planning was everywhere. Folders, spreadsheets, printer hums, calendars with notes I didn't understand. I realized that he wasn't angry. He wasn't sulking. He was preparing. The following morning, I found a new sticky note on the fridge. "Bring forms." I asked what forms. He didn't answer. I tried to laugh it off, pretending it was nothing. But the more I ignored it, the heavier the weight of his silence felt. Every detail, every movement, every calculated gesture told me he was orchestrating something beyond my understanding. That evening, I went to my mother's house for advice. I recounted the week, expecting her to side with me, to validate my feelings. Instead, she frowned slightly and said, "He's not being dramatic this time. You pushed too far, and now he's quiet for a reason." I tried to argue, saying I hadn't done anything wrong, that it was all playful, harmless. She shook her head. "Even harmless actions have consequences," she said. When I returned home, Evan was in the garage, moving boxes and organizing shelves. I asked what he was doing. He said, "Sorting old things." I pressed further. "Our things?" He nodded slightly. "Depends on who keeps them." I laughed, trying to minimize the moment, but it didn't feel funny. His calmness had an edge I hadn't noticed before. Inside, I noticed the faint glow of his laptop. I peeked over his shoulder and saw a spreadsheet filled with dates, events, and notes. The first line read, "Friday, rooftop, Ryan, video posted." My stomach dropped. I closed the laptop quickly and tried to appear casual. He didn't comment, only continued working. I felt trapped in a world where my playful actions had been documented, measured, and analyzed. Every laugh, every touch, every joke, it was all part of a ledger I couldn't see but could feel pressing down. I tried to joke about it, to regain control, but Evan's silence was too heavy, too precise. That night, I went to check the printer. Blank pages had been ejected, another quiet reminder that he was keeping records. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was for work, irrelevant, harmless, but the reality gnawed at me. The meticulousness, the folders, the spreadsheets, they were evidence of calculation, not emotion. The next morning, I woke to find 2 mugs on the counter, perfectly spaced. His clean, mine half-finished. The kitchen smelled faintly of coffee and order. I asked if he wanted breakfast. He said no. I told him it was ridiculous to act like nothing happened, and he said, "It isn't acting, it's recording." I wanted to argue, to push back, but words failed me. Every move he made, every careful gesture, every silent observation carried authority. I realized then that I wasn't dealing with anger or jealousy anymore. I was dealing with control, quiet and deliberate, built over days and weeks, each small action a piece of a larger plan I couldn't yet see. That night, I sat alone, scrolling through messages from friends and co-workers who had witnessed the incidents. Some commented on the humor, others on the awkwardness. I screenshot a few, thinking I could use them as proof that nothing serious had happened. But deep down, I knew those screenshots were meaningless. They didn't account for his silence, his calculation, his methodical approach to everything I had done. In the dark, I realized the house no longer felt like mine. Every corner, every folder, every note he left behind was a reminder that he had quietly stepped into a different role, one that didn't require confrontation, anger, or yelling. He didn't need to argue with me because he was building a record. I had been the one performing, unaware that the audience I had ignored most, him, was already taking note, already preparing. And in that quiet realization, a pang of fear settled deep in my chest. The playful, careless actions I had taken, the moments I had justified as confidence, were no longer harmless. They were recorded, sorted, catalogued, and waiting for the moment he chose to act. The days after the park visit and the dinner felt heavier than any argument we'd ever had. Evan didn't shout, didn't scold. He simply moved through the house with that calm, measured precision that made every small action feel loaded. The kitchen was always immaculate. The mugs, too, opposite sides, remained in their exact spots. The printer hummed quietly at odd hours, ejecting blank pages. Folders labeled Household, Bank, Archive A, Archive B appeared in places I hadn't noticed before. I tried to ignore it, convinced it was nothing, but my anxiety grew with every small, deliberate act. I went about my days as usual, keeping up appearances. At work, people still whispered about the party video, the dinner, the rooftop. I laughed it off, shared the clips with friends, made sure I looked untouchable. I told myself Evan was overreacting. He'd always been dramatic about small things, hadn't he? But the signs were too subtle, too consistent. The calendar alerts on his phone, errands, meetings, personal, seemed innocuous until I realized they always coincided with small shifts in the house, changes in his routines. Folders moved, papers sorted. One afternoon, Marcy called. She asked if I'd talked to Evan yet, warning me that his distance was growing. I waved it off, saying he just needed time. She frowned. Time isn't what you think it is. Be careful. I laughed it off. What could he do? I told myself I was untouchable. I had friends, colleagues, proof that I had been playful, not careless. When I came home that evening, Evan was at the desk in the study, typing with that same deliberate calm. I leaned against the door frame and asked what he was doing. He didn't look up. Organizing, I asked. Organizing what? He said, life. I laughed. Life? You make it sound so dramatic. He finally glanced at me, calm, almost serene. It's dramatic because you made it so. I tried to brush it off and went to the living room. Ryan had sent a message earlier, asking if I wanted to meet for a late dinner. I ignored it. I didn't want any more complications. Yet I felt a flicker of thrill imagining his attention again. I told myself it was just excitement, not guilt. Evan watched from the study, silent, unblinking. That quiet observation felt heavier than any shouting match. That night, I lay in bed thinking about all the moments I'd brushed off. The dance, the party, the birthday dinner, the touches, the videos. I convinced myself I had been playful, harmless, confident. But the meticulousness in the house, the spreadsheets, the folders, the printer hums, they were a quiet record, a ledger I couldn't see but could feel pressing down. Every detail of my performance had been noted. The following morning, I found a small sticky note on the fridge. Bring forms. I asked him what it meant. He said nothing. I tried to laugh it off, but every day, the calm, deliberate order he maintained in the house, the way he moved without confrontation, pressed on me. I started noticing patterns. Calendar alerts for downtown meetings at precise times, blank pages from the printer, folders tucked away with careful labeling. It wasn't chaos, it was method. I tried to regain control where I could. I posted a new photo online, smiling, caption still shining, still me. I told myself he would see it, maybe feel something. He didn't even glance at it. That indifference stung more than anger ever could. It told me that whatever he was preparing, It didn't need my participation. One afternoon, I came home early from work to find him in the garage. He was moving boxes, arranging shelves, labeling containers. I asked what he was doing. He said, sorting old things. I pressed, our things. He nodded slightly. Depends on who keeps them. I laughed nervously, feeling my control slipping. Inside, the study door was closed. I peeked through the gap and saw a laptop open, columns of dates, events, notes, every party, every dance, every moment I had justified as harmless was meticulously logged. My stomach twisted as I realized this wasn't anger. It wasn't punishment. It was preparation. I tried to joke, tried to regain the upper hand. You're obsessive, I said, forcing a laugh. He didn't respond. He only sorted the papers, moved the folders, typed quietly. I realized that every calm action, every silent gesture, every note was a piece of a plan I couldn't yet see. The next morning, he left for a downtown appointment early. A small calendar reminder flashed on his phone. Downtown, 10:15 a.m. I asked what it was for. He said, business. I didn't press. I told myself it was just another mundane task. But deep down, a pang of unease grew. The house, the folders, the quiet, it all pointed to something deliberate. That evening, I tried to confront him. We need to talk, I said. He looked up from the desk, calm, his expression unreadable. There's nothing to discuss, he said. I said, you can't just ignore everything. He said, I'm not ignoring, I'm documenting. Documenting. The word echoed in my mind. Every action, every playful touch, every joke, every post. He had been noting it, recording it, preparing for something. I laughed, nervously, telling myself it wasn't serious, that he couldn't be planning anything beyond ordinary boundaries. But I couldn't shake the tension, the calculated calm in his movements, the quiet order that filled the house like a weight. That night, I checked the printer again. Blank pages had been ejected. I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was work, maybe it was nothing. But each blank page felt like a message, a reminder that he had been preparing, and I had been too distracted, too sure of my own cleverness to notice. The next morning, I woke to find the study door locked. I knocked gently. Evan, are you okay? He said nothing. I asked again, and he finally said, privacy matters now. I wanted to argue, but I stopped. The calmness, the order, the distance, they were all signs that he had already decided how to handle things. And I had no say in it. I spent the day pretending normalcy. I smiled at coworkers, laughed at Ryan's jokes, responded to comments online. But the undercurrent of fear lingered. Every folder I noticed, every calendar alert, every blank page reminded me that he was quietly building a record. He didn't need to shout or fight. He didn't need to make threats. He was creating a foundation I couldn't see, but that would determine everything. That night, I sat on the couch, scrolling through my phone, looking at the comments, the likes, the reactions. I told myself that the world still saw me as confident, playful, alive. But I realized something chilling. Evan didn't need the world to see. He only needed me, and he had been taking note of everything I thought I had controlled. When he returned home later, he didn't say a word. He placed 2 mugs on the counter, his clean, mine half finished, and went straight to the study. I followed, trying to appear casual. You can't just keep this distance, I said. He looked at me and said, distance isn't what you think, it's preparation. I froze. The word hung in the air between us. Preparation. Everything made sense. The folders, the spreadsheets, the printer hums, the calendar alerts. It wasn't anger or sulking. It wasn't punishment. It was methodical, deliberate planning for a day I hadn't yet imagined. I tried to laugh it off, even smiled at him. You're overthinking it, I said. He didn't smile. He just returned to his papers, his calm, deliberate movements leaving me feeling smaller than I had ever felt. By the end of the night, I realized the truth. I hadn't been dealing with silence, or distance, or anger. I had been dealing with control, quiet and precise, built over weeks I hadn't paid attention to. I had performed, justified, convinced myself it was harmless. But Evan had been preparing, documenting, waiting for the moment when my playful acts would meet their consequence. And I knew, with a sinking certainty, that the moment was near. The courthouse lobby was crowded, voices echoing off marble walls. I reached for Evan, expecting a confrontation, but he only nodded toward the clerk. A sealed envelope was handed to me: divorce petition, temporary orders for finances, and the house, custody arrangements for Nate. The weight of every recorded moment pressed down as I unfolded it. Evan walked past silently, leaving me holding the papers, the crowd murmuring around me, and the reality crashing in.